Greetings everyone, and welcome to a different type of video than what I usually do. I'm sure, as you know right now, Russia is currently invading Ukraine. At this point, we're just over the 2-week mark when the initial invasion happened, and this marks a good point to sit back and reflect, I think, on some of the things we've seen and some of the things we've learned since this invasion started 2 weeks ago. To give you guys some reference, within 2 weeks of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Americans had already pretty much isolated Baghdad by this point. It hadn't fallen yet, but it was clear that it was going to fall very shortly. To look at another example briefly, after 2 weeks of the German blitzkrieg into Poland, Warsaw by this point had already been virtually surrounded, and it was very clear that Poland would fall in short order afterwards. So why am I telling you this right now? To illustrate one point, that we can now safely say that the invasion of Ukraine is not those things. This is not a successful military operation which has achieved its goals in short order. At this point, 2 weeks into the invasion, Russia has accomplished maybe one with an asterisk of its major military goals. In fact, at the time of recording this, the front has been very stagnant for approximately 3 days. This to me indicates that Russia is probably preparing for a much longer-term conflict, which, in my opinion, is genuinely terrifying. In any case, with the premise of what's going on right now as I'm recording this video, I just want to touch on why I'm creating this video personally. I, like many of you probably watching this video, have been unable to turn away from what is happening in Ukraine. It's almost constantly on my mind. I have trouble not thinking about it. And there's only so much I can have these kind of conversations with my wife. So now I'm having them with you. And now to the conversation I want to have today, which is 5 lessons about modern warfare we've learned so far in Ukraine. The first big lesson, initially I thought was going to be one of my least controversial on the list. However, when I was bouncing ideas off the Discord in preparation for this video, it turned out to be one of the most controversial. So I'm walking back my initial claim a little bit. My initial claim was that the age of armor is dead, which, yes, is a bit grandiose and hyperbolic. So what I am going to replace that with is that it is going to be very difficult to be cost-effective with armor in the future of modern warfare. Or, just more succinctly put, anti-tank weapons are vastly more cost-effective than tanks. During World War II, one of the lessons that was learned, and this was learned fairly quickly, was that airplanes are just very cost-effective. Air power is extremely useful in all fields of warfare, but arguably most importantly in naval warfare. And not just because planes can spot ships, but planes can attack ships, and planes can sink ships fairly easily. And even if you lose dozens of planes in the attempt to take out that massive battleship, you will have won in the end because the resources you had to invest in those planes was exponentially less than the resources invested into that battleship. And I think we're seeing something similar happen on a little bit smaller scale right now. A lot of the big, low-key military improvements since the Cold War have come in the form of better anti-tank and anti-air systems for infantry. Anti-tank weapons are lighter, more accurate, and more powerful than they have ever been, which now gives the humble infantrymen the ability to take on a metal monster several times his size. And now, seeing this leads to the following question, which is, why would I invest the money into manufacturing these tanks, into maintaining these tanks, into crewing and training people to run them, and, of course, fueling them, when all an infantryman needs to do to take it out is just hide in a ditch or behind a wall until the tank drives by and then shoot it in the back. So it creates this scenario for the attacker where you can't really effectively use your armored vehicles until you clear out all the infantry, and you can't clear out all the infantry until you send in your own infantry really to effectively clear them out, which at that point it makes your armored vehicle simply redundant. I know many people may think that it's too early to make a statement like this, but I just can't see the situation really changing as the war progresses. Perhaps I will be proven wrong, but time will tell. On to the next lesson, which is that intelligence is more important than ever. In addition, I'd also add that hiding your movements is also more difficult than ever. We saw intelligence leading up to the invasion play a critical role. American and British intelligence agencies were practically leaking everything they knew to the public. Then beyond that, going into the war itself, the West has provided Ukraine with advanced satellite imaging and intelligence, which basically allows the Ukrainians to know well in advance of Russian troop movements and where they're likely to attack. When you're on the defensive and have a limited amount of resources, this makes a huge difference. This allows Ukraine to leave areas which are unlikely to be attacked, lightly defended, and redeploy their troops into critical battlegrounds. It's almost like playing a strategy game with the fog of war turned off, especially if you're in a circumstance where your enemy still has their fog of war on, even if they have a bigger army, more equipment, more resources. That advantage is a huge boon in your favor. Before we move to the next lesson, I just want to touch on why it's difficult to hide your troop movements now. Because again, with things like satellite imagery, you're having third-party private companies able to basically gather intelligence on the Russian army's movements, then give it to Ukraine. In the beginning stages of the invasion, people were using phone geolocation data to make rough approximations of Russian troop distributions. There's famous images of a traffic jam at 2 a.m. in the morning, which basically alluded to the invasion happening before it happened. So what I'm saying is that there's all these different sort of ripple effects now that we can see in the information age, which telegraph your movements long before they actually happen. Lesson number 3, and this one is, I suppose, more of a personal debate I've had with fellow military history enthusiasts about what a potential modern conflict could look like. And I'd be interested to hear some of your feedback, but when talking about this, a lot of people I spoke to basically said that offense is going to be back in a big way. Traditionally speaking, you always have an advantage as the defender, so to speak, the home field advantage, which in war counts for way more than in sports. In any case, a lot of people I talked to sort of postulated that in the future, that defensive edge wouldn't matter as much. And I think from what we've seen, that's just not true. Eastern Ukraine has among the most difficult terrain to actually defend. Flat plains, not a lot of obstacles that you can use for cover, should be excellent for Russian tanks and APCs to just roll across. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing Russian armor get bogged down, get ambushed in terrain that should play to their strengths. So why is that? Well, a couple reasons. Some of them are to do with the traditional reasons why defense is always powerful in warfare. You get to set up before the enemy gets there. You get to take all the best spots. You get to be well rested. Generally speaking, you should be able to see them before they see you. On top of that, though, I think there's a fact that with modern improvements in anti-aircraft weaponry and anti-tank weaponry, the infantryman now has a lot more firepower and tools at their disposal. One of the things that I have found very shocking is the capability of Ukrainian anti-air defenses to knock out very modern and very well-equipped Russian jets. That makes gaining air superiority far more difficult, which, as of recording, according to the British intelligence agency, the Russians still have not achieved. In order to go on the offensive, you need to have air superiority in modern combat at a minimum, I personally believe. And if gaining air superiority is harder due to effectiveness of modern anti-air weapons, it stands to reason that attacking would be more difficult. But there's an even deeper reason here that I think is at play, a psychological reason that is unique to our modern times. So that brings me to the fourth lesson, which is that morale is still extremely important and can even overcome material disadvantages. And I think that in the 21st century, the morale of the defenders will almost always be strong, while the morale of the attackers will very frequently be weak. Why is this? Well, to be honest, in the 21st century, we live pretty sweet lives. This isn't the 20th century. This isn't World War I. This isn't 1916, where when I come home from the war, I have a lovely 16-hour shift at the coal mine to look forward to. This isn't 1941, where, yeah, things are better, much better, to be honest, for the average person. You know, you get to listen to your boy FDR and his fireside chats. But still, if you were a kid, you were playing with a poop and a stick, right? But in the 21st century, you got Netflix, you got video games, you've got the capacity to pretty much watch any type of media or entertainment that has ever been created via the internet, and that is just a tiny fraction of what the internet can do. And while yes, in Russia, they may not have the same degree of creature comforts that we do here in Canada or America or Western Europe, they still have access to a great many of the things that I listed, and your average Russian today certainly lives a lot better than they did in 1916 or 1941. So what the hell am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is that the Russian conscript doesn't want to be on the battlefield. He wants to be at home playing Battlefield. This is why I think a lot of the stories of Russian troops sabotaging their own equipment, not wanting to go into battle, makes a ton of sense on a human level. And that's why on a human level, that morale decrease on the attack is increased on the defense. There's a quote I'm going to paraphrase, and I can't remember who said it, and I can't remember where I heard it, so I'm going to butcher it. But basically, it was something along the lines of, the greatest rage comes from the person who just wanted to be left alone, but wasn't. That's Ukraine right now. Russia has unleashed a rage in the average citizen, which has united them in a way they could have never possibly imagined. And going back to what I started with here, because our homes are pretty sweet in the 21st century, we really want to defend them and we don't want to give them up. Ukrainians are unimaginably proud of their home, and they have absolutely every right to be. When the Ukrainian in the 21st century compares themselves to the Ukrainian in 1916 or 1941, they must imagine that they are living the kind of life that their ancestors could have only dreamed of. And the last thing in the world they want to do is give it up. Now, this leaves Russia in a huge bind, because if this holds true, basically the idea of attacking with a conscript army is pretty much inconceivable. The only way you can attack is with your professional army, people whose job it is their entire lives to be in the army. And there's not a huge number of them. Then you run into the fact that you can use a conscript, or I would probably more accurately say a militia army, in defense. And with that, I think we can go into my last lesson. Lesson number 5. So long as a country has a modern military and the will to fight, it will be very difficult to invade them. If I were Taiwan right now, watching the world situation unfold, I would be feeling a lot easier, because Ukraine has proven offensive operations are not going to be easy, and they're going to be even harder to hide coming. Right now, Russia is struggling in about as good a terrain as you could ask for from an attacker's perspective. The idea of being able to invade an island at this point just seems completely inconceivable. First of all, if China was going to invade Taiwan, we would all be able to see it coming a mile away. They would be massing troops, there would be huge amphibious transports, congregated planes, boats, missiles, warships of all kinds. There's no way you can hide that coming in the information age. So Taiwan will have ample time to prepare for the attack, and then China is going to have to attack over the most difficult terrain for an attacker, which is trying to undergo an amphibious invasion. Something which is extremely difficult to pull off logistically and gives a ton of advantages to the defender. I don't see a scenario where China successfully pulls off something like that. Now let's say I were a country like Estonia. What would I be doing? How would I be reevaluating my future military strategy? How would I be equipping my troops to fight a potential coming war with Russia? I would say the only armor you really need is armor which can quickly and safely move infantry to key defensive positions, and then outside that, ensure that your infantry battalions are equipped and trained in the latest anti-tank and anti-air equipment. Then have a smaller air force focused on aerial defense and reconnaissance. And then at this point, honestly, I would think about instituting some sort of mandatory reservist policy or highly incentivizing people to join the reservists. So in case things became truly desperate, you could call upon a somewhat trained force. Then from there, I'd have my professional army focus on holding the borders, and then have my reservists or militia or whatever you want to call them focus on more urban defenses, easily defendable areas, and or working with other professional troops to conduct sabotage operations against any forces which might break through. With something like that, I think Estonia or any of the Baltic nations could hold back the Russians at least until NATO reinforcements arrive. I could go on with examples, but this video is getting long as it is, and it's time to wrap it up. At the end of the day, with modern equipment, I think smaller nations can fight off much larger ones, particularly if that nation is using a conscript army to attack. Because at the end of the day, and let me finish on this point, this is a real fucking war that's happening with real people. Real people aren't simulations. They aren't just going to go where you tell them to go because you said so. They're not going to lay down their lives just because you pointed at a map. They're not just going to give up their homes and livelihoods because you asked. These are real people involved in this conflict. Real people with families, lives, hopes, and dreams, all of which are currently being ground down and destroyed before our very eyes. And outside of giving our own individual contributions and putting pressure on our individual governments for actions, there really isn't that much more we can do. We're all stuck in this roller coaster ride together, and even though we can see the fact that there aren't any more tracks in front of us, we are powerless to stop the course we are on. Try as we might to pull away, this is the course fate has set the world upon. Take care of yourselves, everyone. In these troubled times, let's make sure we have each other's backs as best we can. Well, that brings me to the end of that. Let me know if you like this or appreciated this kind of video. I had a little bit of case of the fire in the lungs, and I just had to kind of let it out. And honestly, I have a lot more I could say. I could come up with 5 more lessons probably. I can extrapolate more on where I think the future of modern combat will go, given these lessons. I can talk about scenarios about how I think this ends, about how I think it will affect the world at large. Like I said, there's a lot more to say here. But for now, I feel like I've said enough. So, this is DeComrade signing off, and until next time, you all take care.